Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. We are in the book of 1 Kings in chapter 3, verse 1. Let's begin. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. We're at the beginning of King Solomon's reign, and they're describing how he began his reign. And they're describing somebody who doesn't follow God completely. Yes, he's going to build the temple, and it says that there, but first thing out of in chapter 3, he married the daughter of Pharaoh. They were explicitly denied marrying foreign women. He was supposed to marry somebody who was an Israelite who worshipped Yahweh, and he made a political alliance with Egypt by marrying the daughter. So his first wife is a foreign wife. He's already violated the law. The king was supposed to set the example. This king was supposed to be the one who followed that law the best. His older brothers that had been sons of foreign women were the ones that got David in trouble. Absalom being the biggest example there. He also was supposed to only worship at the tabernacle. He went to the high places and he let the people go to the high places. And what's the significance of that is the high places were the places the Canaanites worshipped. And the Israelites had forced the Canaanites out by this point in time, and they only dwell in the land. The Canaanites don't dwell there anymore, but the Israelites have started worshiping Yahweh at these high places. And by what we learn later, very possibly, at least at some of the high places, they were still worshiping the Canaanite deities at these high places. And these high places, Moses had told them, do not sacrifice elsewhere. Come to the tabernacle to make all your sacrifices. You can eat meat in your own dwelling. You can sacrifice. You can slaughter a cow or a sheep or a goat or anything else and eat it in your own home. That's fine. But when you make a sacrifice, make it at the tabernacle. All the people aren't going all the way to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices. They're going to the local high place. And the implication is the priests are complicit in this, and that they are setting up a Yahweh worship center on the top of this high place that used to be, and we as Christians do very similar things. We Christianize what used to be pagan rituals, and I get that in Christianity, since we have once and for all blanket forgiveness. If we can Christianize it and make people think it's Christian, really, and get people to worship God, and we have no specific reason other than Easter and every Sunday to have any particular holiday. And I realize this week we're going to celebrate Christmas, Jesus' birth. It was probably not in December. The best evidence, it was in the spring. It might have been in the fall. A lot of people hypothesized that it was very likely Passover week or very close to it. I would love God's sense of humor if it was Passover. But be that as it may, December is clearly not when Jesus was born. We took a pagan holiday that was popular in the early Roman Empire and started celebrating it. And why do Christians even celebrate birthdays? They were not culturally a thing until Christianity started spreading. Apparently, Jesus celebrated the apostles' birthdays from the evidence we have. And the Jews kept up with when their children were born, the day, but it was just a kind of a note in the calendar. This is the day you'll be in after you're older. Some cultures, every child that was born between the beginning of the year and the end of the year was automatically counted as 1 year older on a certain date, generally the first of their calendar year. The Jews kept up with when you were born, and that's when you turned a year older. And so people turned a year older all year long. But there's no celebration of it. There was no, if anything, the husband, the father, would celebrate with the wife that this is the anniversary you gave birth to that monumentous feat. And there's some utility there. I mean, let's face it, the child did nothing particularly to be born. Children that do things in birth actually cause problems. It's the mother that does all the work, and that's why we call it labor. But then with the early church celebrating people's birthdays, and that's apparently culturally where the celebration of birthdays came from, the early church, and that's why we conclude Jesus celebrated the apostles' birthdays. They wanted to celebrate Jesus' birthday, but they didn't know when. And so they grabbed onto the date of a major winter solstice celebration. They picked December 25th because that particular celebration was done on a consistent date of the year. A lot of the other winter solstice celebrations were specifically on the solstice, which will be, it depends upon the year, December 20th, 21st, 22nd. It shifts around a little bit in the calendar due to the wobble in the Earth's axis and things like that. Even the ancients could predict that, and they predicted it well. And but the Jews had been specifically told not to include the pagan practices and the pagan places of worship. Specifically been told, don't go to the top of the hill. Don't sacrifice under oak trees. Don't sacrifice under terebinth trees. And, etc. And they had been told specifically not to practice these places in these the way that Canaanites did. And basically, every community in Canaan, they had a worship center on the top of a hill near where they lived. And it wasn't a temple per se. Very often, if it had a structure, it had a rudimentary structure. The temple would be in town. And then this worship center would be at the top of the hill, and that's where sacrifices went up. In the Canaanite religions, they did not sacrifice in the temples. Some of the other cultures around Israel did. But the Canaanite cultures, they sacrificed at the top of the hill on a bare open altar, apparently. And that's why when you see the confrontation between the prophet and King Ahab and his forces on the top of Mount Carmel, he has them build two altars out in the open, and they can dig a trench around it, and the Baal worshippers have to do their rituals and dance and crown the god and cut themselves and scream at God and beg him, and they make a spectacle of themselves. And since Baal was supposed to be a fire god. He was supposed to light the fire and burn the sacrifice. And he never did. And then at the time of the evening sacrifice, which was, 2 hours or so before sundown, Elijah sat there and prayed, told him to dump water on the altar, water on the wood, and dump enough that they filled the trench around the altar. Everything was thoroughly wet. They couldn't light it. You knew you couldn't light it. And then God burned it up. And burned it up so completely, even the stones of the altar were burned. The water was gone. The trench was gone. There was just a hole. He showed his power. And he also destroyed that top of the hilltop open air altar that was not proper, but he had told the prophet to do that. But he demonstrated his power and removed it so people would not go there to worship him. They were supposed to go down to Jerusalem where he had had the temple built. So Solomon is breaking the Mosaic law at the very beginning. He's married a foreign woman that doesn't worship Yahweh. I mean, I might forgive him if she had worshipped Yahweh and he married her to get her out of a pagan culture and made her queen. But we're going to learn later, she wants a temple built for her gods. So Solomon does that. And she lives there in Jerusalem while he builds all these things that he's famous for. The palace, the temple first, the palace, the walls, etc. And he makes Jerusalem strong. But as soon as he gets finished with all those building projects, then he goes builds her a palace outside the city and a temple outside the city. And he moves her outside the city because she feels uncomfortable in that place of Yahweh worship. And she wants to worship her pagan deities. And so he builds her a palace and a temple where it won't offend the Israelites and moves her out of the city. It simplifies its complications. But he obviously cares a great deal about her, being his first wife. And he let all the people sacrifice at all the high places and didn't discourage it. So he starts his rule not obeying God. The book of Kings is going to interpret him as being righteous, except in, and this is the big one. And then later, his many foreign wives bring his heart away from God. Now, I think his heart was not bonded to God the way David's was. They were very careful how they said it here. He followed all the statutes of David. He didn't follow the statutes of God, of Yahweh. He didn't worship God wholeheartedly. He tried to please his dad. And he obeyed his dad. And he did the things his dad told him to do. Kind of, sort of. But his dad had told him to worship Yahweh and Yahweh only and Yahweh wholeheartedly. And he didn't do that. And because he wasn't wholehearted to Yahweh, he eventually fell away. Verse 4. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? We do see in this passage, he is acknowledging Yahweh. He knows he's a God. He goes to the most important worship center on a high place in Gibeon. Yes, this is the place that Saul ruled from. So it has historical significance, and apparently because Saul had been king there, it was the most prominent worship center. David moved the tabernacle, or what was left of it, and the altar and all the goods that were left that Moses had made in the desert, or had made in the desert, to Jerusalem and had set them up there. But it was not the grand complex it had been when it was moved into Canaan. 400 years of decay, a tent and all the things, they're just not that glorious anymore. They're not new, they're old, they're decrepit. They're nearing 500 years old at this point in time. Or so. And, 500-year-old stuff just is old. Even it's made out of permanent stuff like brass and gold, but the wood and the wool and the flax and those just look ratty. And they may have repaired them through the years. I suspect they have, but the maintenance hasn't been done correctly. Eli's sons didn't do it well, and after Eli's sons, that temple, that worship site, it becomes almost nothing. Nobody goes there. There's no income. It's become very decrepit under Saul, and he obviously put his money into Gibeon. And when David moves to Jerusalem, he probably has the priests and Levites doing maintenance and trying to update it and make it, modern. But the altar is still the altar that got made out in the desert and it's been carried around, except it got set down still for nearly 400 years at Shiloh. And then Shiloh was desecrated and abandoned, basically, and then David finally went and got the relics out of the ruins and brought them back to Jerusalem. It's not the glory it used to be. And so he goes down to the big site, one that God would have said don't do. But he offers sacrifices to Yahweh, 1,000 bulls. It's big, it's extravagant. Let's face it, they didn't burn the whole animal. Part of it was given to the priest, part of it was burned, but the rest of it was cooked and fed to the people. So he's feeding a feast of 1,000 bulls, well, call it half a bull, approximately, to however many people, 500 bulls would feed. It's a huge crowd. This isn't, he's having a big festival. He's feeding a lot of people. The priests are getting a lot of meat too, because they're getting one of the hindquarters. So, 1,000 hindquarters is a lot of meat. The priests are getting wealthy by that day's standard. And then God appears to him. God wants to reveal himself to Solomon and get his heart worshiping him and him only. He wants Solomon to know that he's a real God, the real God, not one of many. And he is asking this question, and most of us read it as like God was making a request to Solomon, I'll grant your prayer. No, Solomon is being tested. What does he want? And if you read God's answer, when we'll get to it, you'll see that God is testing Solomon's heart. And he asks an open-ended question so that Solomon can answer what's in his heart and what's his biggest concern. And honestly, a lot of kings in that day and time, it would have been their fame or their wealth or their prestige or their military prowess. That was the kind of things that kings were viewed as being great by. And we in history do the same kind of thing. I mean, Alexander the Great was a great conqueror. He was not a great administrator. He spread great culture. Cyrus the Great was a great conqueror. He was also a decent administrator, but he came with pre-built bureaucracy that his father and grandfather and great-grandfather built. Nebuchadnezzar the Great was a great conqueror. He had a pretty good bureaucracy under him that had been built before he got to the throne. And he took it over, but he basically let the bureaucracy run the government while he conquered the world. You go on through history. Peter the Great was a great conqueror. He was also a decent ruler. But, we tend to, in history, give superlative labels to kings who were military heroes, who expanded their country through conquering other countries, depriving them of their independence, and subjugating them, and bringing them into their empire. We don't give superlative titles to a king who rules his kingdom in peace and justice and righteousness and has peace with everybody around him and has a big enough army that if you decided you're going to attack him anyway, he'll win, but he doesn't use it to conquer anybody. Instead, he makes trade alliances with everybody, and, we don't honor that kind of man. If anything, he's a footnote in history. He had a peaceful, successful reign that everybody was happy and prosperous. But in reality, who would you rather live under and live with? That king who rules his kingdom in peace and security? Would you rather, under that conquering king, say, Peter the Great, who ravaged half of Europe? Would you rather be in a neighboring kingdom next to Peter the Great and be conquered and forced into his servitude? Or live next door to this king that makes his people prosperous, and by spillover effect, you become more prosperous? And by influence when your king rules more righteously, more justly, and your kingdom is more prosperous because your next door neighbor's kingdom is prosperous. I personally would rather have the righteous king. So Solomon's heart's being tested here. God gave him an open question. He could have anything he wanted. Verse 10. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, and nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, or will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. So God's promised to him, he's tested his heart, And Solomon had asked for a good thing. And God promises me, yes, I will give you that wisdom, that discerning heart, that mind that understands, and you will rule in righteousness and justice and peace. And because you didn't ask for wealth and fame and to be a conqueror, I will give you the effects of those requests in addition to being wise. And made him the promise that there would be no wiser ruler in all of history. Now, that doesn't mean he was the wisest man in all of history. We tend to say that. What the promise is, he's the wisest king of all time. But nobody will be wiser before him or after him as a human king. Now, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ, when he comes for his, being God himself, he will be all wisdom, all knowledge, all justice, all righteousness. God's not making a promise that you're going to be better than Jesus when he comes as King of Kings. Not saying that. But of any human king, Solomon is going to be the wisest king. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody wiser than Solomon could come to earth. In fact, I'm going to postulate there probably been men that were wiser than Solomon that were wise enough to know they didn't want to be king. They wanted to be an advisor, or they wanted to be a businessman, or a minister, or pastor, or a priest, or whatever. And they did something else, and they were wise, and they weren't a political leader. Or if they were a political leader, they were somebody like a prime minister, a legislator, a judge, or a justice, or something, so that they ruled, but under somebody else. But then Solomon gets also given wealth and fame and the peace that comes from having a powerful military. Because his father had conquered all those lands, and if he administers them well, they're not going to rebel, and he's going to gain wealth from it, and being the kind of king that nobody wants to attack, and he makes treaties and benefits you and me both. Kings quickly figure out, hey, it's better to be on Solomon's good side than his bad side. So, sure, we want to be allies with you. We want to be at peace with you. We want to trade with you because you're prosperous and you make us prosperous. And when you're protected, I'm protected. And, it becomes a self-building cycle of good. Now, there's always, in any kingdom, any country that goes that path, there's always somebody that hates from somewhere else. And, if you look at world history, you can find kingdoms that didn't, and countries that didn't go into a big conquering mode, but more an exploring and enterprise mode and benefiting everybody they touched. And they still had people that thought they were evil and cursed and wanted to bring them down. They were jealous. They were haters. But because Solomon, at least initially, sought God out and got his wisdom, he got blessed his life with peace and security because God wanted his people to have the benefit of the effects that David had provided for them, and that David in his righteousness had provided for all his people. And Solomon, his son, ruled after him in righteousness and justice and made the country prosperous. And in doing that, he then had the ability to build the temple, his palace, the walls of Jerusalem, etc., 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 all of the things he built. And doing those building projects made him more prosperous and more famous and more wealthy. And it became a self-feeding cycle. Verse 15. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast to all his court. So, after he realized it was a dream and God had made him this promise, he went to where he should have been sacrificing his sacrifices, and he worshiped there. And he gave a feast to his court, his advisors, his bureaucracy. So he does the right thing after God revealing himself to him despite him doing the wrong thing. God will very often draw us out even if we're wrong, because he will use us despite us being human and despite us being broken and being sinners. Verse 16. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone, and there was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she laid on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your servant was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, but he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours. But the first one insisted, No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine. So they argued before the king. David's being presented with a legal dilemma. It's very likely they were actually women who earned their pay by paid sex. But the word that's in the Hebrew actually very often gets translated prostitute. But they're women who had multiple men. And, of course, there was no such thing as birth control in that day. So if you have sex, you're going to be pregnant eventually. Both of them got pregnant. They're living alone with themselves, so, the 2 women. So if they got pregnant, we know they're having sex with men. Very likely that's why we know, even though the word wasn't specifically the word for a full-time professional sex worker, it was somebody who is viewed as immoral. They're immoral. And they each get pregnant. They have sons 3 days apart. Their explanation for why an infant died when there was no obvious disease is the mother rolled over on it and lay on it and smothered it. We call it SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. We have learned a little bit more about it, and some babies just suddenly die. We've learned things that can help prevent it, et cetera, et cetera. But it really doesn't matter the cause of death, whether she rolled over on her son and smothered him, whether he died of SIDS, God just killed him, what? The infant died. Well, she, in her grief, doesn't want to be the mother of a dead child. She wants a child. In that culture, having children was the mark of being a successful woman. She doesn't want the shame of her son having died. So she switches the 2 babies, and she continues to nurse her housemate's baby, and she claims it's hers. Well, the woman who had her baby stolen from her, when she wakes up in the morning, the child with her is dead, and she starts to grieve because, her child's dead. But when it gets light enough, she looks at the child closely and realizes that's not my baby. I know that when all of my children were born, When you first look at the nursery and the hospital, all babies look alike. But when I saw my child, I knew that was mine. And particularly after the first time, I knew that was my child. That was Nathan, that was Leah, that was Carmen. I knew that. I'd seen them, and that was mine. All the other babies may have looked something just almost alike to me. Your baby and your baby and your baby, I can't tell them apart. Don't ask me to hand you the right baby. But I can hand my wife the right baby. I know exactly which one's mine. And that's common experience. We know our own. And she knew this was not her own and the other one was. And these two women have been arguing about it. And probably nursing the one baby. But it also has to be resolved quickly. And the way that would have been worked, they wouldn't have gone to the king first. That would not have been the way. They would have gone to their local dispute resolver. I'm going to call it judge. A little different role than our current judge, but there were people set up in that society who listened to disputes and settled disputes. And they were part of the government. And if they couldn't decide a case, there was a higher judge than them that was supposed to be wiser. And, if he couldn't resolve it for whatever reason, he kicked it upstairs. And if that person couldn't resolve it for whatever reason, they kicked it upstairs. And ultimately, it would end up at the king. Or, when there was a high priest, at the high priest. And the top guy couldn't kick it to a higher authority. They had to solve it. Oh, it's come to King Solomon. Nobody can determine the rest of everybody is like, yeah, this is a baby, and everybody's Jewish, and the baby's Jewish, and it kind of looks like both mothers. Who's the real mother? We don't know. They don't have parental testing. They don't have the ability to test genetics or anything like that. It's, there were probably some things that were distinctive for certain people, and if the baby had that distinction, it would be clear. But this baby probably looked like both women because they probably looked like each other to some extent. And babies don't look like adults, and it's harder to tell. And you can't wait 18 years to make the determination. You got to make it essentially today. And so they don't know how to handle this. They can't tell who's lying. Clearly somebody's lying. The baby's one of them. They wasn't born by both of them. And so they bring it to the king. Does he know? How are you going to solve that? How are you going to tell who's lying? Verse 23. The king said, this one says, my child is alive and your son is dead, while the other one says, no, my son is dead and mine is alive. Then the king says, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. Then he gave an order, cut the living child in two, give half to one, half to the other. Now this sounds like a fair division. Okay, give half of the baby to each one of them. It clearly kills the infant, so in one sense it's not righteous, but in that society, infants below a certain age weren't viewed as having full human rights yet, because infant mortality was so high that the chances of you living were not that great. And particularly if you were poor and prostituting yourself, the chances of you getting to raise your child were rather slim. So, a lot of people would have viewed like, okay, the baby's died. Yes, so sorry for them. And he says, give half to each. And if that had been his real intent, it would have been justice. Neither one of you get it. And you get to bury both children. And the community at large would have been like, that's just. But that was not really what Solomon was after. Verse 26, the woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son, to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. But the other said, neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two. Well, you can tell by the reaction of the two women who the real mother is. The real mother has compassion. She'd rather see her son raised by this other woman than dead. The woman who's stolen the baby is like, yeah, great. Neither one of us have a kid now. That's fine. And the attitude difference is very obvious. Verse 27. Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. So he determined by their reactions to his initial verdict who the real mother was, and that was his real motivation. And he dispensed justice. He gave the child to the real mother. And everybody knows that he has the wisdom to set up the situation so he can determine the truth. And he will determine the truth. Verse 28. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw he had wisdom from God to administer justice. And so he gains the reputation for being wise and for ruling justly and correctly, and gets the reputation for he will find the facts out and rule correctly. And this will benefit him, and he will rule justly his whole career. Holy Father, we thank you for giving Solomon the heart to want to rule wisely, and for you giving him the intelligence, the craftiness, the smarts to rule wisely and ask for that, and to determine truth and dispense justice and rule in that kind of righteousness. Unfortunately, Lord, he was also a flawed man like we all are, and he wasn't following you with his whole heart like you told him to. You told him, if you will follow me with your whole heart, your sons after you will rule after you forever. But he did not. And so the kingdom was divided and eventually conquered because of his sin. Lord, help us to realize that what we do has long-term consequences, and that there are things going on, and you know the behind the scenes. But Lord, you even still work through imperfect, flawed people like Solomon to achieve your goal. Your temple was built, and proper worship was established, and the people had a chance to worship you correctly. Lord, I ask that you be with us. Help us to become pure people who will repent and follow you wholeheartedly. We will lift you up and hold you in high regard, and that you will work through us, not because we are righteous, but because you are righteous, and you've shed your own blood to cover us in your blood, and count your righteousness as ours. Lord, in this season where we celebrate you coming to earth to be Emmanuel, to eventually the God with us, to eventually be the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, have us to celebrate that you love us, and even the cultural celebrations of gift giving and everything else, and the socialization, and the parties, and the eating, and all the things that we do. But have us turn our hearts to you, to honor you, and to live in good fellowship with each other, and to proclaim your word to everyone we know. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. This was recorded on December 19th, 2023. This is my 42nd wedding anniversary, and so I've taken the day off, and I'm able to get this in. This is, of course, a busy season for lots of people. The church is busy. The times that I normally would have recorded this, I've been doing things to prepare for the cantata that will be Sunday. I invite you to that. It will be an amazing production. It's not going to be a lot of theatrics. We don't do theatrics. We're interested in the message and the quality of the singing. And I think we're going to give one of the best performances as far as the quality of the singing that the praise team has ever done. The message of the cantata is amazingly good, and there are some of the music that the message just continues to haunt me. I hope it sticks with you just as well as it sticks with me. And I want you to invite your family and friends and neighbors and coworkers and anybody you know, even strangers on the street, to see the cantata, because I think it will present the gospel well. I hope to see you tomorrow night at the Wednesday evening Bible study, and if nothing else, I'll see you here on YouTube. You have a blessed week.